Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome to the 23rd webinar in the Irish Bioenergy Association webinar series. And our topic this morning is Bioenergy, Renewable Heat and the 40 by 30 Heat Plan. It's great to see some new faces and participants online that we haven't seen before at this morning's webinar. So just a very brief introduction as to what we do in the Irish Bioenergy Association. So we were established in 1999 and we represent the bioenergy industry on the island of Ireland. We're working on behalf of the biomass, biogas, biofuels, biochar, wood fuels and energy crop sectors. Our main work is in the area of policy, lobbying and advocacy, and we also get involved in transferring knowledge and information to the industry. Our broad and diverse membership includes farmers, foresters, small and medium enterprises, academic bodies, financial institutions, and many other individuals and organizations and companies involved or interested in the bioenergy space. We are rolling out a number of research and demonstration projects, including the European Innovation Partnership Small Biogas Demonstration Programme and our Interreg 3C project. And further information can be found on our website, www.erbia.org. Just a reminder to all attendees this morning that this is the 23rd webinar in our series, and we have rolled out a lot of different topics to date. And just to let you know that all of our recordings are available on our website. And if you would like to get involved in our webinar schedule for the autumn, feel free to get in touch with myself or my colleague Teresa O'Brien. This morning's agenda, I'm delighted to welcome the Erbia President and CEO of the 3CEA Energy Agency, Paddy Phelan, to give an opening address. We're delighted as well to be joined by Dr. Tanya Harrington, Chief Regulatory Affairs Officer at An Post and Chairperson of Renewable Energy Ireland. And then we will have a presentation by Zavier from XD Consulting, who is the 40 by 30 report author. Our panel discussion then will include the questions and answers, and if any attendees have any questions, feel free to submit them to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we will endeavour to answer as many questions as possible. Just a quick reminder to save the date for our next webinar, which takes place on Wednesday the 30th of June. It will be slightly different to our current webinars in that it will be a longer session and it will focus on the support scheme for renewable heat. It will be an information and promotional seminar and be run in association with the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. Full details will be published through our social media and communications channels, and we look forward to welcome you all again back for that event in 2 weeks' time. So this morning's webinar is focused on 40 by 30. It's a 40% renewable heat target by 2030, developed by XD Consulting. It sets out an agreed vision from the industry for the renewable heat sector. It is developed by Renewable Energy Ireland, and Erbia is one of the founding members of REI, and we're delighted to have the chairperson of REI with us this morning. Erbia acted in an administrative capacity for the development of this plan, as REI itself has no resourcing or staffing, so the operation and running of the association rotates amongst the members of the association. The 40 by 30 brings together all renewable energy associations, and it outlines an ambitious target for renewable heat. And this morning we're going to focus on the bioenergy aspects, including solid biomass and biogas, and what it can contribute to a 40% renewable heat target by 2030. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. So our first speaker this morning will be Dr. Tanya Harrington. Tanya, as I said, is the chairperson of Renewable Energy Ireland. That will be followed, Tanya will be followed then by, first speaker will be Mr. Paddy Phelan, President of the Irish Bioenergy Association, and he will be followed by Dr. Tanya Harrington. And then we will have a presentation from Zavier, who is the report author. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Paddy Phelan, who will just say a few words and introduce this morning's session. So Paddy, if you could turn on your camera, and I'll leave it to you to give your opening. So thank you, Paddy.
Don. Welcome everybody to this morning's webinar. My name is Paddy Phelan, and I am the current president of the Irish Bioenergy Association and the chair of the Erbia Council of Members. Today's webinar is an opportunity for the Irish Bioenergy Association, as Sean alluded to, founded in 1999, to promote bioenergy industry and develop this important sector for the island of Ireland. Its diverse membership across many actors in the bioenergy industry have been for many decades now awaiting some significant supports around the decarbonising and cleaning up of the heat sector in Ireland. With the delivery of the solutions from renewable heat, the bioenergy sector would like to see more heat users becoming members with the Irish Bioenergy Association. And the Irish Bioenergy Association sets about offering a barrier-free path to clean, low-carbon alternative, non-fossil based energy sources, which currently produce the majority of the heat in this country. For us, this plan is a really collaborative plan across all the renewable energy associations in Ireland, working right across the electricity sector, heat sector, transport sector, energy storage, solar, wind, right across it, to put together a credible path to support decision makers at policy and developing pathways for companies, businesses, homeowners right across this country to decarbonise. Zavier Debuisson has produced this report on behalf of Renewable Energy Ireland, and within it there are aspects which point towards the bioenergy sector and the role it can play in decarbonising our country by 2030. Within that, there are some key aspects which we identify over the last number of years in this sector to not have been addressed in terms of supports or pathways to decarbonise the heat sector. For example, heat is responsible for just over 21% of our greenhouse gas emissions. It's 40% of our national energy use. And alongside the existing policies to decarbonise heat and transport through electricity, that cannot do it on its own. And there's an acknowledgement across all of the renewable energy associations through this report that there's work for everybody and there are solutions across all the sectors to tackle each of the various aspects in which heat must be tackled. We're delighted to support this vision for renewable heat sector by Renewable Energy Ireland and the incorporation of all technologies and bioenergy, including solid biomass, biogas, biomethane, biochar and other indigenous locally sourced dispatchable energy sources that can be produced locally as well as regionally will assist greatly in reducing the emissions targets and hitting those carbon targets per sector by 2030. The plan sets a new vision that can deliver 40% renewable heat by 2030, while at the same time delivering the 7% carbon emissions per annum reduction. We'd like to thank all of the sponsors across the renewable energy sector and the renewable energy associations in the coordination, and particularly Sean Finan for his work in project managing and coordinating this in-depth piece of work by industry. I now call on Minister Ryan and his department to adopt by the 40 by 30 renewable heat plan in the upcoming revision of the climate action plan, and to ramp up the supports for bioenergy to transition the heat sector away from fossil fuels such as imported gas and oil to deliver significant emissions reduction through widespread deployment of the bioenergy solutions, leading to sustainable employment and an obvious route to decarbonisation for other sectors such as agriculture through bioenergy production. So thank you all very much, and I'll hand you over to Dr. Tanya Harrington, the Chair of the Renewable Energy Association of Ireland. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Paddy. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here today. My name is Tanya Harrington. I'm Chairperson of Renewable Energy Ireland. And just a quick word about Renewable Energy Ireland for those of you who aren't familiar with it. Renewable Energy Ireland was established in 2019 by Mary Donnelly, who's now Chairperson of Ireland's Climate Action Advisory Council, and as an open partnership of sustainable energy associations working collectively to support the energy transition in Ireland. Our shared vision is that by 2050, Ireland will be an energy independent country through the use of indigenous, clean, carbon-free renewable energy supported by the communities across our country. This report, which is authored by Zavier Debuisson, is 40 by 30, and it was commissioned by REI with the support of a number of the agencies here: Renewable Energy Ireland, Irish Bioenergy Association, the Irish District Energy Association, and Renewable Gas Forum of Ireland. We're very grateful to the sponsors for their contributions in the delivery of this work, which is so essential for REI as a platform to engage with government on this important topic. I suppose the report, which you'll all have read by now, it sets out a vision and a roadmap for how Ireland can decarbonise its heat sector. It's an agreed vision for the renewable heat sector from across our industry. And the call to action, as Paddy has said, is to set an ambitious 40% renewable heat target by 2030 in the revised Climate Action Plan. If implemented, this will reduce our CO2 emissions in line with the Climate Action Plan, Climate Action Bill, and also the Programme for Government Commitments. It clearly shows that the plan is achievable and achievable through indigenous sources, mainly from bioenergy, heat pumps, renewable gas and district heating networks. The report highlights that there is no single solution or technology to decarbonising our heating system, but rather we must all work collectively and contribute all our technology, skills and capacities to deliver this. We can heat our homes, schools, hospitals and businesses using a combination of our different heating technologies. This report sets out the REI roadmap for government, and what we would plan to do and are doing is engaging with government, and we've sought a meeting with Minister Ryan and his officials with a view to engaging with them early in the review process of the Climate Action Plan, so that where possible, the additional elements of this report can be embedded into the revised plan. I'll be working with Sean and Paddy and other members of the REI board to achieve this goal, and we look forward to keeping you updated on our progress. I suppose at this point, I just want to acknowledge the role that Sean in particular has played, a leadership role in terms of coordinating this work in conjunction with the agencies and associations that supported it, his own team, Teresa in particular, who's organised this morning's webinar, and obviously Zavier, who's put in the heavy lifting on the drafting. So with that, I might hand back to Sean. I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak this morning, and I wish you well for the rest of the webinar.
Thanks very much to Tanya, and also thanks to Paddy for your opening words. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Zavier. So Zavier, it's over to you to share your slides and to just run through the main findings of the report and the contribution of bioenergy to this renewable heat target. So over to you, Zavier.
Great. Thank you very much, Sean, for the invitation. First of all, I'm delighted to be your, is it 24th, you said, speaker? Yeah, great. And, you know, I've followed some of the sessions, which I found really interesting. And it's fascinating to see the range of topics that you have covered, which shows, I guess, the extent of, you know, the contribution for bioenergy in tackling climate change and the role for energy transition in Ireland. Thanks to Paddy and Tanya for the introduction. So as Sean mentioned, I've been the main author on this report. I must emphasize, been a very significant collaborative effort in that throughout the process, we had regular meetings with the different, with, let's say, the steering committee represented by the different associations involved. And, you know, I found the process of engagement and, let's say, consultation and support for us really positive. And I think that is going to leave a legacy in terms of, let's say, a collaborative approach to deploying renewable heat now. And so, you know, well done to all the, let's say, the steering committee and you, Sean, for steering with the, let's say, the chairmanship or chairwomanship of both Mary and Tanya. So in terms of the study, I want to give you a quick overview of the, let's say, the process. The first thing we did was to look at heat demand in Ireland and develop a clear profile of heat demand currently. So we took 2018 as the baseline, and then projecting future heat demand to what it's anticipated to be in 2030. and then looking at the renewable heat sources available in Ireland to decarbonize our heat supply, and then looking at the different technologies and renewable heat systems to meet the current, let's say, the future heat demand, and then modeling different scenarios of renewable heat deployment, so that a comparative analysis could be undertaken, out of which a pathway to decarbonize Ireland's heat supply with, let's say, intermediate target of 40% for 2030 was selected, and a series of, let's say, KPIs were derived from the analysis, which I'll cover later. And very importantly, there was let's say, detailed reflection within the group and the different members of the steering committee and their representative association to feed into, let's say, the chapter around policy instruments, and you know, we basically, what is the asks from the sector to government and at national and local level to support the decarbonization of heat supply in Ireland, and also commitments by industry to take action. So a number of initiatives have been stated, and a declaration of intention very clearly setting out how the industry is going to support that transition. So let's look at heat in a bit more detail. So far, heat has been kind of I would say, the neglected sector in terms of renewable energy and decarbonization. In fact, the let's say, national understanding of heat is let's say, limited, and so delving in available data to develop a clearer profile of heat was an important first step. And heat is actually a very significant part of, let's say, the issue, the problem, if you want to call it that way, in terms of, or the challenge in terms of decarbonization. Heat represents about 21% of the national greenhouse gas emissions. So it's significantly more than electricity, for example. Agriculture is about a third of all emissions, but heat is above 20%. So it's very significant. It's also about 40% of the national energy use. Every year, we spend about 3 billion euros on sourcing our heat supply. Most of that is imported in the form of fossil fuels, with 90% fossil fuel contribution to our overall heat supply. And we're depending for 65% on imports of energy to meet our heating requirements, which is fundamental thing, you know, in terms of keeping our homes comfortable, our hospital heated, and our factories going. So then we looked at the heat demand into the future, and we took the National Energy and Climate Plan scenario with additional measures, so which kind of represent the policy landscape and what's expected as an outcome of the policy landscape as it is now for 2030. And out of that, let's say, analysis of those projections, we derived what the future heat demand is likely to be. If we look at 2018, so here on the left, on let's say the left bar in the chart, you can see that we're currently about 45 terawatt hours per year in terms of heat demand, with the building sector representing, I'd say, in the region of 60% of the heat demand, and industry playing a significant role there. But that role is going to grow into the future, where we see industry thermal energy demand growing significantly, while through energy efficiency, energy retrofits, we're going to see a drop in overall heat demand in the residential and in the tertiary sector. Another way to slice heat demand is to look at the temperature profile, and that's really interesting in informing the kind of solutions that are suitable for decarbonizing heat supply. So in that context, we looked at the, let's say, distribution of different temperature profile in terms of heat supply. And as you can see here, a lot of our heat demand is at the relatively high temperature. So, let's say above 50% of our heat demand is in excess of 100 degrees Celsius for heating buildings and hot water. And then, sorry, between 60 degrees Celsius and 100 degrees Celsius. Then above that, in processes, we have a big band of heat demand that's between 100 degrees Celsius and 400 degrees Celsius, then very, very high temperature above 400 degrees Celsius. And again, through the expansion of economic activity, industrial production, we're going to see a significant rise in the heat demand at those temperature profiles. So really, heat and industry are going to be two important aspects of the challenge, and will require specific solutions. We also see a significant increase in the range of buildings, homes in particular, that will be heat pump ready, where heat can be supplied at temperatures below 60 degrees Celsius and met efficiently with the likes of heat pumps. So then we looked at all the renewable energy resources available to decarbonize heat across the whole spectrum. So there was an extensive, let's say, literature review and discussions and data gathering with the different associations involved in the study to look at, how much solid biomass do we have, what's the extent of let's say the availability or the suitability of heat pumping in the building sector, biomethane or biogas, the role of district heating, solar energy, geothermal energy, and also very importantly, the availability of waste heat. So out of that resource or potential assessment, the kind of key message that came clearly out of that analysis, that there is a lot more resources available than our future heat demand will be. So you can see on the graph on the left that the extent of the renewable heat resources available in terms of the potential that's been identified. And on the right side, you've got the similar pie chart I showed you earlier with the projected heat demand. So, again, the key message there is that we have plenty of resources within Ireland to meet our future heat demand and to decarbonize this with renewable energy sources. Within that, we see a very important role for bioenergy, with about 34% of the potential resource available. Surplus heat, which hasn't been really featured very much so far in the debate around our options. Represent a very significant potential. We have about a third of the overall potential identified. And then obviously the electrification of heat will play an important role through the deployment of heat pumps, but also capturing excess electricity in a highly intermittent system with very deep penetration of wind energy and solar energy into the future. And then we've identified significant resources available from deep geothermal energy and solar thermal energy as well. So let's zoom in on two sectors which I assume will be of interest to the audience and the Irish Bioenergy Association membership. So for solid biomass, we have identified readily available resources for 2030. So essentially forestry that's in the ground and growing, and every year we estimate that by 2030 there will be 3.3 million cubic meter of timber available from forestry and wood processing. That represents about 6.3 terawatt hours per year. There's an element of post-consumer recovery wood available too at 0.4 terawatt hours per year. And we also anticipate an aggressive afforestation program that should yield very significant bioenergy resource in the form of short rotation copies, with about a projection for 68,000 hectares planted, which will yield 2.9 terawatt hours per year of wood fuel. and concomitantly short rotation forestry plantation program will follow short rotation copies, and by 2035, so within 15 years, we'll have a newly planted forestry, or let's say intensive forestry, in the region of 150,000 hectares, which would represent a resource of 6.7 terawatt hours. So in terms of renewable gas then, the biogas resource is available for 2030. We're extracted from a number of resources, and overall we have, let's say, a band of potentials available as identified in those studies. Between slurry manures with a potential resource of 0.7 to 1.4 terawatt hours per year, segregated food waste representing 0.6 terawatt hours per year in biogas or biomethane, and then the more significant resource would come from grass silage, with projections between 3.4 to 8 terawatt hours per year of potential available. So in discussion with the relevant associations, we adopted two potential contributions in terms of our projections, one by Arbia and Cray, equivalent to 1.6 terawatt hours per year by 2030, and one by the RGFI with a more ambitious program of anaerobic digestion deployment, achieving 5.6 terawatt hours per year by 2030 as a resource. There are other potential resources available for the production of renewable gas, including the treatment of residual municipal solid waste with 1.1 terawatt hour potential identified, tallow with 0.8 terawatt hours per year, and bioLPG with a resource of 0.5 terawatt hours per year in indigenous resources, and the potential to import another 1.1 terawatt hours in bioLPG. So when we looked at different, let's say, scenarios and potential deployment of renewable heat resources and associated technologies, we modeled different options and adopted a central scenario, should we say, which shows that achieving a 40% renewable energy supply for heat is very achievable, and that would put Ireland on track to achieve a 7% CO2 abatement per year, as in the Programme for Governance targets. Within that central scenario, district heating meets 10% of the heat demand in homes, so that would cover about 190,000 homes, and buildings in the services sector, using surplus heat from power plant, waste energy plants, industry and data centers, and to a lesser extent, bioenergy outside of the main urban centers. But the focus here would be very much to target areas with a very high degree of heat density in our city centers primarily. Solid biomass will play a very significant role in that scenario, with 18%, with solid biomass meeting 18% of the national heat demand using forestry products and byproducts, again referring to the projection of 3.3 million cubic meter per year, and energy crops with a plantation of 68,000 hectares of short rotation copies being productive by 2030. And that solid biomass will be primarily dedicated to meeting high temperature applications in industry and in buildings that would be harder to retrofit and require higher temperatures to maintain a comfortable environment, and generally replacing oil, coal and peat. Heat pumps will play a significant role. So there are clear targets in the climate action plan and the program for government to deploy heat pumps in 600,000 homes, and we project that we'll meet about 20% of the national heat demand in buildings, as well as using district heating as a medium to capture medium temperature heat sources from data centers or water bodies available available near our urban centres. Biomethane will play an important role as well. We've about 60 medium to large AD plants deployed at that stage, which will help decarbonising the gas network, and bio-LPG to act as a substitute to oil and solid fuels in off-grid applications. So what does that scenario translate in terms of the main KPIs we're interested in? First of all, on the left, you can see the breakdown of thermal energy consumption between the different resources and systems we've envisaged. And what you can see from the 2018 baseline to our central scenario of 7% decarbonization per year is that we 40% of the overall final energy supply will come from renewable energy sources for heating requirement. And within that, biomass, as you can see, biogas and district heating and ambient heat from heat pumps will play a very significant role. We've electricity driving those heat pumps and use of direct electricity. A further share of renewable energy will be available to meet our heat demand. And we can see a significant diminishing role for the incumbents in terms of fossil fuels. The result in terms of decarbonization is that scenario can deliver almost 50% CO2 reduction in the heat sector by 2030. So in terms of cost benefits analysis, obviously there'll be significant costs in terms of capital investment for the deployment of the renewable heat systems, which we estimate at 9.6 billion euros between now and 2030. Overall, the cost of the heat system, so if we consider let's say, annualized cost of that capital investment, as well as the operation and maintenance cost, as well as the energy supply cost, we're going to see an increase of 250 million euro per year in our overall heating bill compared to 2019. So that's a 7% increase. The cost in terms of abatement is estimated at 86 euro per ton abated of CO2, and that compares to a carbon tax projected to be at 100 euro per ton of CO2 in the program for governments. And you know, it's interesting to see that there's been a very significant increase in the level of let's say, the pricing of carbon, which is now at around 50 euro per ton. So I think, you know, that there are clear signals in that regard, and decarbonizing heat with renewable energy options will pay significant dividends into the future in terms of CO2 abatement. The levelized cost of heat supply has been estimated at 76 euro per megawatt hour. So that's going to be an increase on the current situation in terms of where we're at with fossil fuel costs in terms of natural gas, oil, etc. But again, you know, in the context of increased CO2 cost, it's anticipated that renewable heat will be cost effective. The benefits are very significant. First of all, we're decarbonizing by almost 50% our heat supply, and our overall greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced by 10%. We'll be moving from 6% renewable energy share in our heat supply, which is the lowest in Europe currently, to 42% renewable energy share in our heat supply, which would be close to the level Denmark is at currently. So we'll be catching up essentially. But that will be double what the National Energy and Climate Plan scenario is for 2030. So that, you know, will require a significant increase in ambition and in improvement in the policy framework. The other positive is that our energy import dependency will drop from about 64% currently to 34%. So our security of supply will dramatically increase too. Overall, we're going to see €1 billion saving on fossil fuel imports. So that saving will be reinjected into the local economy in terms of, let's say, capital investment that we required, as well as replacing fossil fuels with indigenous renewable energy sources. Job creation it will be very significant. We estimate that 23,000 new full-time jobs will be created in average over the period between 2000 now and 2030. Sorry, type on the slide, and 50% of that will be in the production of renewable fuel. So we foresee very significant job creation in rural Ireland, in particular for the production of biomass fuels. So in terms of how do we get there? So as I mentioned earlier, there was an extensive consultation and discussions within the steering committee and the representative associations as to what policy framework we need to achieve that 40 by 30 scenario or target. Overall, there are 40 actions recommended for government and industry within the report. So I won't give you the full list today, but that's available in significant details in the annexes of the report. But I'll mention the top 5 we identify as, say, cross-sectorial, so across the different renewable energy resources available and the different, let's say, subsectors involved in the process. What we see is that there's a clear demand for updating the building regulations and the BR assessment method to reflect properly the benefits of renewable heat in terms of decarbonization. We also look for a simplification of the regulatory and administrative requirements for funding scheme. So essentially cutting down the red tape and making the grant system work more efficiently and to become more accessible. Also, very importantly, the implementation of Article 23 in the Renewable Energy Directive, with introduction of a renewable heat obligation scheme, which will require an annual increase in the renewable energy heat share in our heat supply by 2% every year. Let's say the public sector needs to lead by example and set very clear green procurement targets with an annual increase of 20% in the share of our heat supply from renewable energy. And finally, to widen and improve the supports for renewable heat in terms of incentives across domestic, the tertiary sector, as well as the industrial sector, with the large heat users being provided with specific instruments that will help them make that transition. So I think that's it for me right now. I'll stop sharing and happy to engage in discussion and Q&As at this stage, Sean.
That's great. Thanks very much, Zavier, and thanks for your very comprehensive presentation. And indeed, I'd like to acknowledge all your hard work and efforts in actually bringing the report to fruition. There was lots of discussion, debate, and over and back within the steering committee, but I think in the end, everyone worked very closely together to get the final report over the line and approved. So I'd like to acknowledge your leadership in getting that and hard work in getting that that through. So we have a number of questions coming in. We will come to them in a couple of minutes, but just maybe to open the discussion, maybe if I go to you first, Paddy. Bioenergy obviously has potential, and Zavier has outlined all of the sectors of renewable heat, the different temperature ranges. Can you just outline for us the opportunity from a bioenergy perspective across all the temperature ranges and the various technology options which are available at those different temperature ranges?
Yeah, thank you, Sean. So as many of the members of ERBIA will be aware through their vast experience in this space, there's a significant portion of the 6% that's already been delivered in terms of renewable heat, which we all acknowledge is halfway to where it needed to be on the 2020 renewable energy targets established in 2009 by the Irish government in response to the Renewable Energy Directive. And now that appetite in Europe is set at 32.5% from renewables by 2030. But we in Ireland, through the programme for government, have set a carbon reduction target that's even more stringent at 51%. So when you analyse across the sectors that, you know, Zavier would have looked at and we debated over many meetings, and, you know, the data and a lot of good work done by Noel and Eugene on the working group relating to particularly the domestic wood fuel sector. So, I mean, dry timber, dry to below 20%, is a significant opportunity in terms of those dwellings that are more difficult to achieve the heat loss indicator levels required for heat pump technologies. And the cost of investment is significant in retrofitting a home to become heat pump ready. And you know, it's well appreciated and understood across all sectors that there's a significant amount of dwellings that, you know, the cost benefit of upgrading to a heat pump ready home is so significant that the alternative may be, and most likely will be, to consider you know, wood fuel quality assured under the wood fuel quality assurance scheme, and burnt in accordance with, you know, best practice standards around dry timber. So that's a big area that's already existing, and a bit more work in regulating that will see us capturing the value in terms of emissions reduction in that space. As you move into the SME sector, then there's the existing SSRH program, which is open and alive. It's been quite slow over the past 2 years in terms of getting projects through it. There's a lot of regulatory and process orientated aspects to that application process, which has seen, you know, a significant number of applications and a reasonable number that are now passing through to completion. So there is an operational support for 15 years for up to 45,000 euros per annum to convert over to renewable biomass or biogas. There are no biogas projects that have come through the program yet, but through our own work in the Energy Agency in the Southeast, we are working on a project hopefully for delivery in the next heating season, where we'll see a biomethane road delivered gas solution with a local energy supply, seeing the local authorities convert over to renewable gas to heat their off-grid buildings in a pilot. So there are opportunities there, but the barriers are still challenging in terms of converting SMEs and businesses over to renewable heat. Heat pumps, again, are within the plan, and the great work of Zavier sees them working collaboratively together on this track to 2030. So this isn't a plan to say do biomass instead of heat pumps. This plan is identifying that there are certain buildings, but particularly as we move into the higher heat demand space, that need temperatures greater than 60 or 80 degrees. So they're above the space heat normal range. And here is the area where we see the real opportunity to take people from the heavy fuel oil or fossil gas requirement they have in terms of their manufacturing or process. And currently that sector is not supported to come off the relatively cheap fossil gas or fossil oil, heavy fuel oil sector in terms of their demand. And really the primary tool we see in that at the moment is, as alluded to in Zavier's presentation, is the carbon tax rising towards 100 euros by 2030. So many will have seen a hike in the past couple of months, particularly in the solid fuel space, where you'll see that increase per kilowatt hour production. However, we do believe when you consider that the cost to utilize natural gas is between 2.5 cents and 3 cents a unit and oil is not much more expensive, there is a need for there to be some supports at that higher heat user, big demand. And that's where we'll see the real numbers tumble in terms of taking us off the fossil drip feed or the imports and producing that locally. Again, very importantly, in this study, and Zavier put a lot of work into the resource assessment. So I believe the work that Zavier has done in collaboration with the steering group has identified credible supply chains, that these resources and materials are out there. The technologies are proven in other jurisdictions, and really it's making access to those options more achievable for businesses and homeowners is the critical part to delivering this plan to 2030.
Okay, thanks very much, Paddy. And if I come to you, Xavier, in terms of the high temperature heat sector, there's quite a significant proportion of our heat demand at the high temperature range. Can you just maybe outline the potential technology options at that particular temperature range and the potential, I suppose, for bioenergy to deliver at those high temperatures?
Yeah, I mean, very clearly, bioenergy should play a very significant role in addressing the requirements of the industrial sector, and there are, let's say, two renewable heat technologies that are envisaged in that regard. One is using solid biomass in biomass boilers or in CHP units, and the cement industry being an important aspect of our heat demand, of our thermal energy use, and CO2 emissions. The use of solid biomass in that sector can play an important role, and equally for the high temperature application, we see biomethane playing an important role there going forward. And in particular, the food sector currently is really putting strong ambitions forward in terms of decarbonizing their operations, and biomethane is seen as a front runner in that regard. So I think bioenergy overall is to play a very significant role in the industrial sector.
Okay, thanks, Xavier. And it's good to hear about the opportunities at all of the different temperature ranges from a bioenergy perspective. If we just go to the questions, just before we go to the questions, I see just from Aidan there, can the slides be sent after made available? So we make the recording of the event available on our website, so full details will be available on the RBA website, and that will be sent around to all attendees as well via a link. So that will give you access to the full recording. And
the report is available on the REI website.
And the report is available on the REI website, and we'll try and post a link into the chat for the report for anyone that hasn't seen it during the course of the webinar. Maybe Teresa could do that for us. Turning to you, Xavier, there's a couple of questions in here, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to post them to the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. So Niall has a question, the first one, about data centers being harnessed, or heat from data centers being harnessed for district heating, and is the industry happy to cooperate? So Xavier, would you like to comment on that, about the potential for waste heat from a district heating perspective?
I can't speak on behalf of the data center industry. I have to say, my investigations didn't go as far as having a lot of meetings with them, but in generally, we see an important role in capturing excess heat, or let's say surplus heat available from data centers. We're going to see an explosion in the let's say installation of data centers, and it's going to be very important that from a planning perspective, that those data centers should be located near urban centers where let's say their surplus heat they produce can be captured to service the heat demand in urban centres, using district heating as the vehicle to connect the dots, put it that way. And and the Tala district heating project is a very good example of that in action. So it's an urban data center, and it will now supply heat in a number of public buildings and apartments in Dublin, and that it should be the model for data centers deployment in Ireland.
I suppose data centers have a responsibility in terms of decarbonisation. So
absolutely, yeah. And it's not just about renewable electricity supply. It's about closing the loop and having a circular approach to let's say sustainability and their energy supply. Their impact in terms of electricity demand will be tremendous. It's already very important. So there is a responsibility for the industry and the sector to make to really participate to the decarbonisation of heat in particular.
Okay, if I come to you, Paddy, next for the next question, if new homes are rated to BER A1, is a district heating scheme necessary? So perhaps you just want to comment on the various energy ratings and the heating requirements of those, Paddy.
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and that's assuming that you're just looking at the demand as opposed to the potential supply. So when we look at district heating in an urban setting, for example, and we would have looked at models around Kilkenny, Abbey Quarter redevelopment, and then with Codima in Dublin, we would have looked at projects around City West campus, where there's a lot of excess heat available. There's gas peaker plants planned. There's various heat sources there, and there's also plans proposed to develop over 9,000 domestic units in that sector. So when you analyze that, you'd say, okay, they're very low heat demand, but in terms of an infrastructural investment, there's going to be industry and SMEs on that network that will have a heat demand. And then, if you look at some of the European models, where if there is some solar thermal and you have some domestic hot water storage, you also have photovoltaics and you have excess electricity that's not required, and you convert that into hot water, then there are potentials for those markets to develop around the sale of your heat from a domestic. So instead of just looking at heating, you look at heating and cooling, number one. But number two, then you also look at, community supply. So, it just requires a little bit of outside the box thinking. So almost becoming a trading platform. So your excess heat is used by somebody or some business on your network, as opposed to not doing it at all.
But obviously, you're higher your energy rating of your home, and that the less energy requirement you'd have. So you probably wouldn't even have a requirement at a BER A1, Zavier, would you, from a heating point?
Well, there's two aspects. First of all, if we, in terms of the Irish District Energy Association's vision for district heating deployment, it's very much focused on the high heat density areas, and the heat atlas is very useful in scoping where that is, and the associated resources available to supply the heat. And you need to remember that we have a vast existing housing stock and building stock that, yes, will improve over time, and we need to plan for that in terms of, let's say, the design of our district heating systems. But the district heating can be a very good solution to decarbonize those at a significantly reduced cost compared to a deep energy retrofit, for example. So, I think we need to open the envelope in terms of looking at potential solutions. If you take Dublin, for example, there are a number of, let's say, historical or heritage buildings that you can't do too much in terms of heat demand reduction. And these, together with public buildings, for example, hospitals, etc., can provide those anchor loads in urban centres, and then that provides the infrastructure onto which you can start connecting the domestic sector. So there are clear strategies. We're not the only one planning to do this. They're doing it in Holland currently, starting from nowhere. And then if we look at the current development in Scandinavia, where they're moving to very low temperature, fifth generation district heating system, there's plenty of scope to address our current building stock as well as the future building stock.
Okay, if I could come to you next, Paddy. Zavier in his presentation outlined the target or a proposal in the plan, and it is only a proposal in the plan, it hasn't been adopted by government in terms of policy as of yet, for 68,000 hectares of energy crop and 150,000 hectares of short rotation forestry in terms of the biomass, solid biomass resource. There's a question here about who's going to lead in the development of that resource, and particularly the short rotation forestry. Perhaps would you like to comment on that? Because we know there are issues associated with the implementation of the forestry program at the moment. They need to be addressed in the short term, but could you just comment on the resource, that projected potential resource which could be put in place?
Yeah, so thank you, Sean. So for many of you who will have been involved in the bioenergy industry for the past couple of decades, we've all had the experience of a scheme in place for farmers for willow and miscanthus, which didn't deliver, and it was a cart before the horse scenario, where the demand for the material was not out there. This supports, again, as we've identified on a number of occasions, and Zavier alluded to the forgotten sector in heat, and how to decarbonize it. So there's a lot of lessons learned there. A significant percentage of the forecast is coming from the main forestry space. Where if you look at the private forestry sector, the afforestation program started in the early 90s, and a lot of those through the forest forecast provide the numbers behind the increase in solid biomass available for the years to come. But in tandem to that, there is also, under the program for government, proposals, and we hear Professor John Fitzgerald speaking last week on the public media, the former chair of the Climate Council, suggesting that a simple measure like every farm producing 4 to 5 hectares of timber in terms of afforestation. So the opportunity remains there. We also have a significant challenge around water quality. So when you look at the full land use life cycle scenario, short coppice rotation, willow and others have a huge opportunity to uptake a lot of these excess nutrients on riverbanks, and some strategic planning around the agriculture sector and how some supports could be implemented through the new CAP program to put in bands of short rotation coppice, willow, eucalyptus, others, all of them have their challenges, but also significant learnings that can be multi-benefit solutions to the support of and the rollout of these. So I think that in general it requires a well-planned, well-organized, but importantly providing a multifaceted solution, particularly in the agriculture space, to dealing with many of the challenges that we see facing that industry at the moment.
Okay, thanks very much, Paddy. And I suppose just one very important point to clarify for anyone that's unsure, or obviously the material that would become available for renewable heat from the forestry sector would be as a result of sustainable forest management. So it would be thinning material, maybe other brash material. So just to maybe very clearly point that out, that the most valuable use for that resource obviously is in the construction sector and the structural timber sector, but just that the residue or the material for the bioenergy area is as a result of sustainable forest management. Zavier, over to you again. Just an interesting question there from Paul. Did your research explore pathways to achieve zero emissions heating in 2050? Mm-hmm. And if so, could you comment on this, please?
Yes, absolutely. So we very much kind of focused on 2030 as let's say the timeline for the analysis. There's a sense of urgency, and the call to action is for now, for things to happen now, but very importantly, putting in place the infrastructure and the systems that will bring us to the ultimate target of decarbonization by 2050. Let's say in terms of to show the range of opportunities, we in the report you'll see there's a res max scenario, and that scenario builds on the res 7%, so the 7% abatement scenario per year, and achieves a 67% reduction. And again, that's looking at the range of options we have currently, and not really looking at the kind of technologies and options we might have in 10 or 20 years time in that regard. And that scenario builds significantly on well, 2-3 things. One is a significant role for biomethane or biogas, generally speaking, to decarbonize the heat sector, with a contribution to the effect of 13% of the overall heat demand, if I remember correctly. District heating to play a very significant role, so much broader deployment to cover a significant share of the heat demand that's a suitable heat density, and no major change in terms of electrification of heat, and further penetration of solid biomass too, and a role for solar thermal energy to play, in particular around district heating.
Okay, thanks, Zavier. So I'll just go to Paddy maybe, and this we'll come back then to you, Zavier, for there's 2 questions there at the very end, and we can combine both together.
Sure.
So Paddy, just in terms of we haven't discussed the potential and opportunity for biogas stroke biomethane. And there is obviously the conundrum as to what is the most valuable and most economically the best use for that resource, be that heat or transport. So maybe would you comment on the potential that you see from a biomethane, biogas perspective, and also where that would be potentially used if we were to see some supports introduced in Ireland of some sort for the development of that industry?
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, the big numbers that Zavier has tabled there in terms of heat being one of the largest areas in terms of the target for decarbonisation, but a significantly large area that requires decarbonisation also, it's actually larger in terms of energy use, is transport. So the solutions around transportation decarbonisation, and we in RB are working on a piece of work on the transport side over the coming months. So obviously having to look at the overall challenge and the overall targets. This is looking at the heat target for 2030, setting it at 40% renewables. So there is going to be competing markets for the likes of biomethane, grid injected, or that through the transportation sector with CNG and LNG filling stations. And we've seen this right across Europe, where the value market for biomethane, where grid injected, is into the transport sector, because it's got a higher energy base cost in the context of price per unit. So that would place a higher requirement to attract that across into heat. So it's about getting that balance right, Sean. In some cases, the rural opportunity around transported compressed biomethane for heat, or LPG type scenario, and then obviously the gas grid injection opportunity, which will help to decarbonize the existing fossil gas system. It's really about access to that energy supply is going to be critical, and ultimately they who are prepared to pay most will get the cleaner product.
Okay, thanks very much, Paddy. And if I could maybe just conclude by asking Zavier just on the 2 final questions. One is about, and I think you've clearly shown this through your analysis, do we have enough biomass to make it enough for district heating stroke energy generation, looking from a broader perspective, a future scope? And some European countries are using waste electricity for district heating. What do you think is in store in the future in terms of district heating technology in Ireland? So just the 2 final questions, Zavier.
Yeah, okay, and it's good to see the interest in district heating. In terms of let's say the central scenario in the report, we're looking at district heating being primarily for using waste heat from, let's say, in the higher temperature range. That would include data centers, where the use of a heat pump to uplift the temperature provided by those data centers is an element of the solution. Going forward in a deeper decarbonization scenario, district heating is envisaged to cover 35% of the heat demand in buildings, and in that context, we see two main sources of heat supply. One is at a high temperature level, using let's say power generation surplus heat, waste to energy surplus heat, as well as geothermal energy. In the lower temperature bracket, again, data center will play a role, and heat pumps will play a role. But we also see bioenergy at that level of penetration for district heating to play a role of about 5% of the heat supply coming from bioenergy in that projection. And the idea there is to concentrate in maybe more rural towns where access to waste heat might not be available, and therefore bioenergy is a good solution in that context. And we see the role for electricity in district heating being adjoined with using heat pumps in particular, and to play a role in terms of demand response. And I think there is really a lot of potential with large-scale thermal storage, and then district heating systems. You know, they are going to be multiple sources in that space, and so you know, you might see a district heating system with some biomass, some geothermal energy, and a heat pump to capture the dispatch down electricity that will be available at times, and then store that possibly over a season, and really have much stronger integration between the electricity sector and the heat sector.
Okay, Zavier, could I just ask you maybe for just a very short concluding remark just about the overall plan itself, and just
well, I'm let's say, you know, you were kind of thanking me earlier, and I certainly will return those thanks, because it's been a really good experience for me. You know, I've learned a lot through my interactions with the group and through the research that has been done, and you know, I think this is really a first in Ireland. I know, and there's a number of studies that are ongoing that will complete the picture, and that's all very good. We need to learn a lot more about how to decarbonize our heat supply. This is kind of a milestone in a way, and putting a stick in the sand, and clearly asking for support to get a lot more traction in achieving the kind of targets we need to set for ourselves. So I'm very excited, actually, and I see heat surging in terms of how we address climate change and drive into climate action agenda, in conjunction with energy efficiency, obviously, but I think we can achieve more rapid decarbonization of our heat sector by really pushing an emphasis on renewable heat. So I think there's plenty of opportunity for the bioenergy sector in particular.
Very good. Thanks very much, Zavier. And Paddy, just I know we're going slightly over time, and we'll conclude in the next minute, but just to, if you want to just, have you any concluding remarks, Paddy, just to offer this morning?
Just to note, there was another question there. I possibly answered it online, so I moved away from Paul Martin. Just obviously advocating for and categorically, 100% agreeing that, you know, fabric first energy efficiency is a given in all aspects of our targets. So not just the renewable energy targets, but the energy efficiency targets. So I think that's an important point. Yeah, just to thank you, Sean and Zavier, particularly on behalf of all the members of Erbia, for all of the work. And I just, you know, reiterate Zavier's enthusiasm and excitement around the opportunity to, you know, this very, very clear and concise report gives the evidence that's been somewhat and often called for from government to how much likely it will cost, and to plan for the decarbonization of our heat sector. So thank you all very much. Thanks to all the attendees. and looking forward to interacting with you over the coming weeks and months in promoting this plan and bringing it to the attention of the decision makers, be that local, regional, national, or even international level. It needs to be communicated, and the evidence-based approach, I think, is a clear one to help change the mindset of those making the decisions around our heat sector to 2030 and subsequently to 2050.
Thanks very much, Paddy, and thanks for your concluding remarks and attendance this morning. Also, thanks very much to Zavier for all your work and for attending this morning. I suppose the work really only starts now in terms of trying to get this into government policy and advocated to the various stakeholders that need to know about the plan and what we have included within it. I'd like to thank all our attendees this morning. I'd like to remind you just briefly again that our next session is in 2 weeks' time and we'll focus on the SSRH. I'd like to also acknowledge Teresa O'Brien and her work in terms of getting all this set up, and indeed acknowledge all Teresa's work in the design of the report, who Teresa project managed that particular aspect of the report, and thanks to Teresa for all her work, because the report does look really good. So that's really all. Just to conclude, I hope you all enjoyed this morning's webinar. I hope you all learned something from it. And I encourage you to look back at our previous recordings of the various webinars we have on our website, and we look forward to welcoming you again on the next occasion. So stay safe, everyone, and have a good day, and we'll talk to you all again soon.
Thank you, Sean. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.